Hey, little helpers. So recently we've done some episodes on relationships, breakups, and some episodes on cluster B personality disorders like narcissism and antisocial. And that's led to some people reaching out and asking questions about, I was in a relationship that looked like this and now I'm struggling. Was this abuse? Was it not abuse? I'm confused, like a lot of confusion. And so Kibby and I wanted to do an episode just on emotional abuse to really understand what it is and what the long-term effects of it are. Kibby, how would you define emotional abuse?
Emotional abuse is actually really tricky because I think when people think about it in terms, and we're talking mostly about, like in romantic relationships in our adulthood. We'll also talk about it in our childhood too. But I think when people are reaching out, they want to know, like, is my boyfriend or girlfriend emotionally abusive? And it's sneaky because it's not as obvious as physical abuse when you're actually like physically violent towards each other. But it's a little bit more subtle, right? It's like this, it might be manipulative. It might make you feel bad. You don't know why, because that person really loves you and was really nice otherwise. So we looked into the literature and saw one of the best and clearest definitions of emotional, also called psychological abuse, is this. So it's a relationship in which your partner targets your self-worth, notions of safety, and personal freedom. So what this looks like is attacks on your character, kind of putting you down, might threaten you either, really obviously or really subtly, like if you go out and do this or hang out with these people, I'll be really mad at you, or I'm going to take this away, or sometimes even like overt threats of violence, right? Like I'm gonna like one example I saw was like, I'll lock you in the basement, which is pretty extreme.
Yeah.
And personal freedom. So, for example, like controlling where the person is going, or getting really upset at the person, even just talks to someone on the opposite sex, or likes to travel or go anywhere. So it's really restricting the partner's movements and activities. So
it's so hard to pinpoint some of this behavior sometimes, because in relationships we naturally limit each other to a certain extent, or some relationships are more cool with that than others. I don't like very limiting relationships, right? But my relationships are still more limiting than like a polyamorous relationship might be. And so it can be hard to figure out, what really rises to this level. But, we have this checklist that I think can help elucidate some of these behaviors.
And also to clarify too, it's like maybe verbal abuse is more obvious, and also verbal abuse is seen with both men and women. And we're not, in this whole thing, we're not just talking about women are abused, right? There's actually evidence that both genders feel this way. Yeah. But verbal abuse might be like, like, you're a piece of shit, fuck you, like all the, someone screaming at you. But emotional abuse has sometimes this level of like hidden messages that are not spoken. So like, kind of like an or else, like if you do this or else, or this kind of like put down that might be more subtle, like, right. Like kind of eye rolling, or just, just saying, well, of course you're not good at that, or just like kind of more subtle.
Right.
It could be veiled in jokes. It could be veiled in like a moment of anger that later on the person goes, you know what, I said that out of anger. But it's more of the effect of the person has over you, which is like, you feel like less of yourself. You feel like down and less of yourself, questioning yourself. And then sometimes even like, as if you're like a caged animal, right? Like you're afraid to go anywhere because you're kind of trapped. Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm getting from, at least like trying to understand what emotional abuse is versus other kinds of abuse. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And emotional abuse is interesting too, because physical abuse is emotional as well. Sexual abuse is also emotional. And so it really encapsulates a lot of this. But yeah, I mean, I remember, so my sister was in an enormously emotionally abusive relationship with her ex-husband, and just little things he would do, like, after they divorced, she would say, hey, could you please take a photo of the bathtub? I want to get that for my new house. And he would just ignore her, not do it. And then I think at some point, he made some comment like, you couldn't possibly... It was a way of stonewalling so that she just got more and more crazy Like, why can't you do this simple little thing for me? And he knew that's what it was. It was more worth it to him to make her crazy than to take a picture of a bathtub. There's just things like that. Like, you can be manipulative without using insulting words. Yeah. One item on this this Gottman emotional abuse questionnaire that I really related to was, I'm worried most when my partner is quiet. So, I mean, there's no words involved, right? And that's what's so scary, because when they're quiet, you know that there's threat coming, and you don't know if you can predict it or not. You don't know what's coming, and they just drag out that silence. Yeah. So that you're sitting there in fear.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, the scale that we're talking about. So I think we talked about John Gottman before, Gottman. So he's like one of the field's experts on romantic relationships. And I think they've actually made different versions of the emotional abuse questionnaire. But I love the one that you pointed out, this kind of like, when it's not obvious that silence would be scary, right? It's not like, that wouldn't necessarily tick boxes on domestic abuse, but it shows like the state you're in, right? You're just like on eggshells or just nervous. They're on the scale, and we'll put this up on the website. So if you're curious, like, really look through it. But some are obvious, like insults to my family, insults my ethnic background, humiliates me in front of others, right? Like, if you've experienced that, a lot of those relationships would feel like kind of obviously abusive. But sometimes it's like stuff that would be more subtle, like questions my sanity, tells other people personal information or secret about me, right? Like that doesn't obviously seem like emotional abuse, but think about what that does, right? It undermines you.
Yeah, it tries to catch me at inconsistencies to show that I'm lying. I mean, probably some of us have done that at some point or another, because the person in front of us lies a lot. Right. But if you don't, and it just seems like every conversation is a test. And that puts you in such an alert sort of state of tension. I remember one thing my therapist talked to me about this wasn't about a particular relationship, but sort of a history of a form of emotional abuse that I lived with. And I was saying, like, trauma doesn't feel right. Like, there's no like one big event, and I say these things as a therapist, knowing that's not necessarily how trauma works. But he was like, this feels like an erosion. This feels like, the war veteran who was in Afghanistan and they never saw active combat, but they're in this constant fear of stress and tension and fear. And that in itself is traumatizing and has long-term effects. And I think emotional abuse can take that form of this just erosion of your well-being, of your sanity over time. And that's why it's so sneaky, because it can be hard to spot until you're in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially, I can imagine it's especially dangerous when you're talking about a really new relationship or one of your first relationships, because let's say someone is attacking your character or questioning your freedom or anything like that. If you don't know yourself well or haven't dated around a lot, that could come across as like true things. For example, one of my very first relationships in high school, I've talked about this guy before, but we were teenagers, so I was, we were exploring a lot. We're traveling sometimes, or hanging out with new people, making new friends, right? We're like exploring ourselves and developing our identity. And he would have just subtle ways of putting me down based on my choices. Like, he was really big into the accusing me of flirting. I'm not a really flirtatious person, but every time I hung out with another guy, even if it was a mutual friend, he would just say something to get at my self-esteem or get our identity. He was like, well, I really support you hanging out with friends outside of me. If you really need to hang out with guys to make yourself feel better or make yourself validate that you're worthy or attractive, like, I get that. I think it's kind of sad, but like, if you need that, I support you.
Oh my God.
And I remember, and I would go and hang out with my guy friends and think, why am I doing this? Is it because I need the attention, male attention? And it just was like this little seed that planted, and eventually I started questioning myself. Right. And it was just especially harmful because I was like 15. So I didn't know. I didn't know myself.
Oh man, that hit a chord with me too. That was, that was something that was definitely levied against me several times. Yeah, I think, you know, when I was younger, I had a much older ex, and he would wield his age and maturity over me. And I think in similar ways. And it's really hard when you're young, because if your boyfriend is 20 years older than you, they do have more life experience. And so it's believable when they say things like that, like what he said to you, like, oh, you know, maybe that is what I'm doing because I'm young and it's kind of embarrassing that like I'm insecure and this is, I guess, what I need. And he's noticing that about me. So you can buy in so easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially in intimate relationships, like romantic relationships, or with your parents or best friend, you feel like this person knows you so well and knows you better than you probably know yourself, right? Which is true in many ways. And then if they have this negative view of you, or if they like have discovered this flaw, this like deep insecurity or flaw, sometimes it is seductive because you're like, wow, this person really knows me and sees me.
Yeah.
For all of my fears. But if they just bring it up all the time to hammer it in, you know, like, eventually you just feel crappier about yourself and you can't actually grow. Yeah. Right? It's like, it's one thing if the person sees your insecurity, is another if they use it as a weapon against you to like, you know, restrict your freedom or make you feel scared to like step out away from them.
One thing that I notice that I do sometimes, and I think this helps me actually understand who I can trust better than others. But it's a bad thing that I'm doing. Okay, I'll say what it is. Sometimes I hand a narrative of myself. I'm like, I am irresponsible, I'm messy, I'm incompetent, and I'm narcissistic. And then some of that is true, but most of it is really overblown. I'm just pathologizing myself. When I give you that narrative, you respond with, I don't think that's what's going on. I think you have a view of yourself based off of some past events. And that needs a lot of tweaking. And this isn't what I see. Maybe I see parts of it, and here's where. But I've had partners who would take that narrative and use it to abuse me. And that was really easy for them because I already had buy-in, you know?
Right.
So they could take the worst things I would say about myself and then throw them back in my face over and over and over again, knowing that I couldn't completely question it because I'm the one who, you know, gave them the idea in the first place. Right. So I think that can happen too, because when you have a partner, you trust them, you give them your insecurities, you tell them about yourself, and so they have easy pickings then. Yeah.
It's really subtle too, because, for example, you know, you and I like to talk about our, I don't know, we would pathologize ourselves or we like our eccentricities, whatever. We like to put labels on it. And we might say that to each other, like, you know, you're like, oh, Kibby, like, you make fun of how sometimes I'm obsessive compulsive or workaholic, right? I've had other people make fun of me for that, even though I say this out loud, but it's the difference between someone who's saying it maliciously to put you down and for you, like, when you say it, I know that we have respect for each other. So it's like, haha, yeah, we're narcissistic. We have ADHD. Like, it's not just the words. It's like the intention behind it of, I'm doing this to make you feel worse about yourself versus like, no, I actually love you and respect you. And, you know, even with these qualities, right? So.
Right. Well, I mean, the other day, yesterday you were upset about, you know, motherhood and how hard it is to have a full-time job and all of that. And that if I were abusive could have been an opportunity for me to be like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is just you being a fucking workaholic, you know, and like not appreciating time off or whatever. But no, that's like a time to say, I know this is hard for you. And like time off or time, you know, time doing not as much as you would like to be isn't comfortable for you. Yeah. And you know.
Yeah. I understand. That's why we wanted to do this episode, because it's like, how do we define this? And this is such an insidious type of relationship that can have really long-term effects that you aren't even aware of at the time. It's easy to blame on yourself. It can affect other relationships. I mean, people, there was part of the research that I've done too, that people who have experienced abuse in the past tend to abuse others in their present too. So sometimes like people might take on those qualities and start to like pay it forward in that tough way. So then you're like, wait a minute, who's at fault? You know? So it's tough.
I was actually talking to a friend who was in an extremely emotionally abusive relationship. And she was talking about how she accepted so much of it because she knew that he had been abused as a child in really bad ways, you know, like really legitimate abuse. And so much of her response to him was, okay, he's doing this because of what happened. You know, he doesn't know better. He's struggling with so much. It's hard when you see your abuser ultimately as a victim. And many abusers were victims. It's just whether we, the current abused, need to take on the responsibility of loving someone who hasn't learned how to love, but, you know, at our own expense.
Right.
But I think a lot of people with compassion and empathy, later on, they wonder, like, how the hell did I get into this situation? I'm such a bad person. You know, I feel so because they've been made to feel like a bad person. But really, one of the reasons they stayed was because they wanted to show this person love. And they were so compassionate towards this person that they just said, okay, I can handle this. I can handle it. It's okay. I'll just get through it. I know this is coming from a place of pain. I love them, so I want to cure their pain.
Yeah, it's tough to be in the position of trying to heal old wounds. You see this in couples therapy all the time. You see this in, you know, patients where they have this anger and pain from their childhood emotional abuse, and they're trying to work through it, like, you know, in the benevolent way of saying it, like work through it in their current relationship. And what that could look like is abuse, right? Like, you don't love me enough. When you do this, it hurts me. You know, just like basically it's like fill my void. And then the other person tries so hard, and it's a fool's errand, right? So yeah. And I'm saying this to not pathologize or demonize anyone, right? Both the abusee and abuser can be very, very hurt, and it's hard to point out a monster. I mean, we said this many times in other episodes. We don't condone being like, let's find someone and call them the narcissist, emotional abuser, blah, 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 and they're just like a non-human. Yeah. Except for really extreme versions of antisocial personality disorder. But like, for the most part, people who tend to be emotionally abusive have been really hurt themselves. So it's not as easy as pointing out, like, I'm going to find a bad person and then wiping them away. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It can get extra confusing too, because when you're being abused, you become oftentimes defensive, angry, hurt, and you can start acting in ways that aren't really aligned with how you would prefer to treat them. Yeah. And so then when you walk away from the relationship, you can say, well, shit, I did things that I regret, and I wasn't acting like a good person or the person I want to be. And so maybe this was all my fault. I mean, it just gets so convoluted. And I just know so many people who come out of these relationships, including myself at various times. And I'm just like, what happened? Like, what just happened to me? How did I stay? How did I get into it?
This is a moment I want to plug my own research, but an old study I did, when did I do this? Oh my God, 2015? Jeez. Okay. So one of my studies back in the day, actually used like over 34,000 participants. So it's a really cool database. And, this data asked a bunch of people all across the United States questions about their past, about their physical abuse and, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and like emotional neglect and physical neglect in childhood. So did they experience this childhood maltreatment in the past? And then what are their relationships like in the present? Is there are they victims or perpetrators of domestic violence? Or do they both perpetrate and victimize? So what I was actually thinking would happen was that certain kinds of abuse or neglect in childhood would lead to certain kind of behaviors in the present, right? That's not actually what I found. I actually found that first of all, if someone's experienced one kind of abuse in childhood, they most likely experience a whole bunch. And all of them combined will lead to all different kinds of behaviors, being a victim and perpetrating and both. And this happens in both men and women. So I would say that, I think it's sometimes when we want to understand the long-term effects, we're like, okay, if a kid has been emotionally abused in the past, or if their parents did this, what kind of partner are they? Are they abusive? It's not as clear as that. It's like all different kinds of abuse and neglect leads to all kinds of abusive behaviors in the present. And there is one part where sexual abuse has a particular link to being a victim of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in the present. So if you received, if you were a victim of sexual abuse, you're more likely to be a victim in the present. So, but yeah, I just thought that was interesting because it's not a one-to-one. If you experience this, you end up doing this. So if someone has a hard childhood, it could play itself out in all sorts of ways in the present adult relationships.
But there was still a high correlation between childhood abuse and future abusive behavior? Okay, yeah.
Very strong.
My hypothesis there, I guess, would be that when they were children, love was experienced as a form of power and control, or as a function of power and control. And so then when they're adults, it's not maybe so much that they are repeating the exact same behaviors, but they may go on to see their romantic relationships as functions of power and control, or of needing to suddenly be in control when they were victimized before, or of, being re-victimized because they only know submission. And those behaviors can play out in different ways, but it's sort of the same process.
Yeah. Like we're basically taking what we learned is love and kind of playing it out. And I think about it, but in the terms of unmet needs.
Yeah.
Right. When you're a kid and you're emotionally abused, if the parents are attacking you or putting you down, you have this unmet need of like being admired and appreciated and loved by your parents. Right. And so it really just have this like, it creates a void that you try to deal with in your present. And the idea that then you have this idea that love and being appreciated is a scarce resource. It doesn't come and flow freely. If you find someone who loves you, you gotta keep them under your thumb and don't let them go no matter what. Maybe you tell them that they can't find love outside of you, or make them afraid to leave you. And then, so that scarce resource is kept. Right. Yeah. So that's how I think of it sometimes.
Oh. Yeah. And interesting, someone said something interesting to me today about emotional abuse, which was, when they're a kid or whatever, and you try to go to other people and you say like, my dad, did this, my dad said this, my dad didn't hug me when I cried. A lot of people, especially in communities where there's a lot like really high stress, like impoverished communities, a lot of people say like, okay, so what? He's your dad. He's teaching you how to be a man, or, he's gonna set rules down. So it's really hard when you're fighting with like, they basically said like, if I were to say like, my dad hits me, somebody would be like, oh no, that's terrible. I said, he sexually abused me. Oh no, that's terrible. But emotional abuse, you can get re-invalidated because people don't see it as that big of a deal. But one thing that you and I both saw in the research is that while emotional abuse, unless it comes with threats of violence or sexual abuse, it doesn't count for a PTSD diagnosis because of the way diagnoses are stupid and, specific. Yeah. But emotional abuse tends to have even more PTSD symptoms than physical abuse.
Yeah. So just so if people haven't listened to our previous episodes on this, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and we diagnose that disorder, there's actually a really strict criteria and standard for what is a trauma, right? Like Zach, our advisor, says capital T trauma. And that is usually defined as something, some event that happens that threatens our physical or even psychological safety. So sexual assault or being in an accident, right? A natural disaster, war, things like that. And when people have that, then they could be diagnosed for PTSD symptoms. So when someone says, yeah, I had a boyfriend who really attacked my character all the time, made me feel crappy about myself, that's not going to give you a PTSD symptom. But the research shows that people who have had that kind of relationship actually have, as you said, symptoms of PTSD.
Sorry, you said that's not going to give you a PTSD symptom. It's not going to give you a PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant, a PTSD diagnosis. But it will give you a PTSD symptom.
Symptoms, yeah, and more and more symptoms than physical abuse does, on average. Yeah. Which is so important to capitalize because I think, again, like I was talking to my friend who was in this terrible relationship, and, she'd be asked questions like, did he hit you? And she found that so invalidating because she's like, oh, well, yeah, maybe things weren't that bad because he didn't hit me. But the scars from this relationship are unbelievable. I mean, the abuse that she went through is unbelievable. Yeah. But we get so much invalidation from the outside world about it, and we often invalidate ourselves. Yeah. And say, it wasn't that bad. I didn't get hit. It wasn't that bad. I didn't get called a cunt or something like that.
Right.
But it's got this wear and tear process, and it's so subtle, and it has this long-term effect on your self-esteem, on your ability to trust.
Yeah. Well, before we go into the effects of it, something that popped up as we were talking, this question, what about people, let's say you have a couple, let's say you have one person who's cheated or has actually done something to violate the trust of the relationship, either cheated or broken up or done something hurtful to the other person. And then that, person B, the second person, reacts with a lot of the stuff we talk about of emotional abuse, right? Like putting them down sometimes or not letting them go out with their friends, or especially people with the opposite sex, like gets jealous a lot. Like what would you say in terms of, is that emotionally abusive, or is that like justified because the person screwed up so badly?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's tough. I would say it's emotionally abusive. I mean, if you're, because you have a choice, you can leave, and I think there are, you can ask and collaborate on what you need to build trust, right? Like you can say, I need you home by 10 p.m. for a set period of time, or I'm going to get really, really, really anxious, and I don't think I'm going to be able to stick with this. And then that person can agree. But that's different from berating them if they don't follow that rule. It's different from giving them the silent treatment for 3 days, or insulting them. It's so. Yeah, and you might say, I need an open phone policy for a while, and the person can agree or disagree. So I think, there are ways of healing from this that are not abusive. It's very hard to be that methodical and mature about it when something like that happens. And so oftentimes people go the route of anger and bad behavior. Yeah. And I wouldn't then say of that person, oh my God, they're a terrible person. But you don't have to be a bad person to engage in emotional abuse.
Right. Right.
And also being a bit of a dick for a while that's not necessarily emotional abuse either.
It is really tough because I'm thinking about how when that happened, let's say someone cheated, that person's going to be in the doghouse for a while, so to speak, right? Which means that out of anger, person B, the victim of that, is going to be a little bit more controlling, a little bit more degrading, angry, right? More attacking, right? There's just going to be like nastiness there. And if they decide to stay together, you could work through that and eventually forgive. But it almost, in my mind, this is not based on research, but in my mind, it almost seems like intention and length of time that would determine if it crosses over from like an anger response and being hurt to like emotional abuse.
Yeah.
Here's an example. One of my really good friends was in this relationship with a guy who actually turned out to be pretty emotionally abusive. And this was one of our first relationships, early on, she broke up with him. And he was really hurt by it. Legitimately, it was very hurtful. But then he used that. In hindsight, we know this, but he used that to kind of control her for years after it. What that looked like was, at first, she was really, when they got back together, she was really sorry. And he was like, basically, yeah, you got to make it up to me. And so she kind of worked really hard to mend the relationship, build his trust back, go visit him a lot, like do some things that he was asking. Yeah. Okay. But then after a while, that started to snowball and just like stretch out for years. Eventually, it was like, well, I want to work on my music career, so you need to basically support me. Oh my God. And you need to do this because like you hurt me so badly, and this would really show that you're committed to me and our relationship. Right? I mean, like, could
he's just
be
keeping her
legitimate.
Hostage at a certain point. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
that's only seen over time, right? If it happened just in that week, I mean, we might be like, all right, you have to build trust somehow. But after a while, you're like, wait a minute, she's held hostage.
I mean, I think a couple of things. One, if I get cheated on and then I scream at the guy and say that he's a worthless motherfucking piece of shit who didn't deserve to be born, and he can't love, and he's a narcissist pig, right? I wouldn't say that like I'm a bad person who is an emotional abuser, but that would be an abusive behavior.
Right. Yeah. That's like outright mean and degrading. Yeah.
Right. So you can be emotionally abusive or abusive, like even if the other person ostensibly sort of deserves it. Ultimately, nobody deserves to be called worthless.
That's true. Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. No one, I don't know.
Yeah. And a tip following that is like, because then I'm thinking like, some people might be like, oh God, I did that. I'm my emotional abuser. I mean, a tip for that is always don't attack the person. Don't attack the person's self-worth or their freedom or, their integrity. Attack their behavior, instead of like, you're a shitty person. Like, that was a really shitty thing you did. And that really hurt me. Right.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And yeah, sometimes we do things that we regret, and sometimes we do shitty things to other people. But to be able to have the humility and apologize and change is different than being in a long-term emotionally abusive context where they use it to entrap you, right? I mean, that guy, it was in some ways, it may have been the best thing that happened to him because he just got to have a field day for the rest of their relationship and get anything he ever needed and feel justified in doing so.
Grab. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not good. That's not good.
Yeah, that's not good. We wanted to mention in terms of long-term effects, because if you are listening, you're like, I think I might have had one of those relationships. There's a nice study that I read. It's called The Effects of Traumatic and Abusive Relationships by Orzek from 2010. It's a nice, I like the study because it does mixed methods. It did both quantitative analysis of like survey data, but it also asked people like, what were your abusive relationships like? Have you had one? What effects did you have? And they found, first of all, that something that research always shows that if someone had one kind of abuse, they've had many kind of abuses. So, but that they did find that with emotional abuse, or also called psychological abuse, it really had effects on self-esteem. Yeah. Like the way they saw themselves, their identity, their schemas for who they are, and emotional turmoil, meaning that afterwards they were really, really sad or depressed. They had this like a lot of negative emotion. So what that looked like in the participants' responses is if the participants reported having an emotionally abusive relationship, they might have said things like, in the long term, they felt like my self-esteem has gone out of me. They were not always sure of myself. They also had a lot of difficulty trusting new relationships. So they were kind of hesitant to get into another emotional commitment. That's not just for emotional abuse, that's for all of them. But they might say that they didn't trust in real love again, right? Not willing to allow themselves to commit. Right. Yeah. So it wore away at their own sense of self-worth and their trust in other people and love.
Well, I would imagine, I mean, one thing that I've experienced like way back when was it wore away at my trust in myself to make good decisions and to spot a villain, basically, like to spot threat. It's very scary when you look back and it seems so obvious that you were being mistreated and yet you chose to stay. And so then it's like, well, how can I trust myself in the future to know, who's safe to date?
What did that look like then for you? Like, how did you cope with that? Or how did you know were you aware of it at the time when you didn't trust yourself?
Yeah. In some way, I shut down emotionally for a while, and I actually had a bit. So another thing that can happen is a sense of empowerment that comes from it. And that first relationship, I did kind of have a sense of empowerment, and it was twisted though. It was, I now know what it's like to think somebody loves me and to really love them and for it all to be a lie. So I can deal with rejection. I can deal with being fucked with because I survived it. And so I was actually in some ways more comfortable going out and even like meeting douchebags and being like, I can beat them at their own game, or I can play with this and then back away when I need to. So in a way I kind of trusted myself more, but I didn't really trust myself because I was keeping myself emotionally detached. I wasn't sure I trusted myself to emotionally attach. And that took years, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I got re-victimized.
So speaking of which, then it's like, what do you do about that, right? I mean, that's the thing with different kind of relational trauma. One thing that's pretty sad is that someone might avoid intimacy, avoid trusting, and then they might feel like in control, right? They feel powerful, they just date and throw people away or, whatever. Or like stop caring what people think of them, right? But then that starts to feel like this blanket coping strategy, right? Like, I'm not going to trust anybody. I'm not going to let anyone in.
Yeah.
And life is a little bit more nuanced. There's more gray areas in that, right? And you might want to let someone in, but then you're like, how do I even gauge that, right? Like, it's so much easier to have like a hard and fast rule. I trust no one, right? Or I sleep with everybody, right? It's a lot easier to be standardized than to be like, okay, I'm going to really feel out the situation and know how far I can go.
Yeah.
So like, and when you have these blanket rules for yourself, like, I don't trust anyone, what that does to you is, first of all, keep you super safe because you're not trusting anybody. You're not letting anyone in. But it also really, it also stunts your radar. And what I mean by that is that you really cut off your ability to learn how to trust somebody, right? To learn how to get to know someone, how to feel them out, kind of see the signals of red flags and green flags, right? So you start to either get like too afraid or you go too all in, but your radar of, is this a safe person? Am I a worthy person, right? All of those things of being able to figure out gray areas are completely stunted. Does that make sense too?
It does, yeah. I mean, that's what avoidance of any kind does, is it prevents you from learning anything new. Yeah. And so you get stuck in your old kind of patterns of thinking, which is often based in fear. So so you never get to practice meeting new people, discovering new information. And then you wind up in the same situation that you were talking about earlier of like this being a first relationship, and you don't have the disconfirming evidence to counter the manipulation that they throw at you.
Yeah.
I think I was good at dating, and I would kind of fuck around with people who were similar to him, but I would date very different types. But maybe I was overlooking some of the essential qualities that he had. I would look for like less overtly narcissistic men, and I think there were some subtler traits I needed to look for. So knowing that emotional abuse, while not a PTSD, while it doesn't lead to a PTSD diagnosis, but it does involve significant PTSD symptoms, one helpful therapy can be cognitive processing therapy, and this is something that both of us have have done with patients. But Kibbe, why don't you describe this treatment?
Yeah, cognitive processing therapy is really cool. I even think I'm going to look for this, actually. I can't remember the name of it, but there is a podcast series out there that goes in depth into this treatment, and I really love it. So yeah, so it's a CBT, it's a cognitive behavioral therapy, and it mostly focuses on cognition. So the idea is that we come into the world with a just world theory, where we come in, as a kid being like, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, right? The bad guys get killed at the end of the movies, right? And good guys like become heroes. And then something terrible happens to you and you're like, how do I make sense of this? Someone just emotionally abused me. Like, how? I thought I was a good person, but obviously I'm not. So your mind starts to try to make sense of these horrible things, and sometimes makes rules or beliefs that just keep you stuck, called stuck points. So, for example, if you go through an emotionally abusive relationship, you might have this belief of like, I can't trust myself. I'm bad. I'm a bad girlfriend or bad boyfriend. I hurt people. I'm not worthy of love. I'm no good at all. I'm kind of broken. This is something I thought to myself, like coming from my past with my mom and like struggles with anxiety and depression. I was like, I'm so messed up that if people really got to know me, they would be freaked out. Yeah. So I'll kind of keep them at a distance. So you start to have this, like, as I was saying, like these blanket, big, swooping, generalized beliefs. Everyone's all bad and I can't trust them. I can't get close to them. I'm all bad. I can't let someone see the real me, right? And that keeps you stuck because you then don't, you do a lot of avoidance. You avoid relationships. You avoid growing intimacy and things like that. So
what do you do?
That's the background. Yeah. So CPT then walks through the different areas that trauma tends to affect. And these areas involve trust. Like, how do I know if I can trust someone? Trusting yourself, power and control, self-esteem, and self-intimacy. So you go through all these areas and you really talk through your beliefs about them. And then you identify ones that are keeping you stuck, right? Or not helping you move forward, not helping you connect to the things that you care about, the people you love. And then you challenge them. You challenge this kind of really standard cognitive techniques of really trying to evaluate them. Okay, I'm so messed up, I can't be loved. Is that true? Is there, what's the evidence for and against? Is there another way to think about it? And maybe we could even get that radar back of like, okay, like, let's really look at the evidence. Let's look at the facts of the situation and figure out, okay, when can I trust someone? When am I, like, what behaviors that I do, like, are worthy or good? And what are some that I need to change? So you really, instead of going from this, like, overall general belief, you kind of get more nuanced about it and have it fit the reality a little better so that you, learn how to move forward.
Yeah, and I mean, eventually what you do too is you try to look for these beliefs happening in your real life, and so you try to keep track of them, and they can show up in kind of funny ways. I had a patient who really believed that she couldn't get angry ever, and it was because there is a belief, like, if I show my true self, if I show my emotions, people will leave me. And anger is one that so many people have a problem with. So many people feel like they can't show it. And then just realizing throughout the day, like, where anger showed up, and the immediate urge was to to suppress it. But these all of this came back to emotional abuse from childhood, and sometimes in like seemingly unrelated ways. So it's cool when you have this stuck point, this kind of core belief, and you see how it spiders out in different ways. So, Kibbe, tell us about an exercise that might happen in CPT around trust.
Yeah, so people who have experienced an emotionally abusive relationship in the past are going to be like, oh my God, I learned that I'm broken. I'm so depressed. I was belittled so much in my relationship, or this person kind of, wore away my ability to be like free and loving and close to others. How am I ever going to trust again? Right? I feel like that's something that you and I have asked ourselves after bad breakups like many times. How am I ever going to date again? So this is an example of an exercise that's based on CPT that I thought it was really nice. It's called the Trust Star. And basically what you do is, if you have someone, a loved one or yourself who has trouble trusting someone, this is a cool exercise you could do together, because you don't have to be like, go ahead and trust everyone, dive in, see what happens, take a risk, or cut them all out. If you see one red flag, cut them all out. This helps you kind of really have a better, more thorough understanding of like, what do you need to trust someone? What are the signs for you that signal this person's trustworthy or this other person's not, right? So I'll put the worksheet on the website, but basically you could just picture this. Right now, you could list out for yourself different qualities that really describe someone you trust. Like even picture in your mind a person in your life, a mentor, a doctor, a parent you really love, a best friend, and picture and really think about like, what about that person makes you trust them, right? One could be when you tell them a secret, they keep it a secret. Or when another sign could be like, if that person is feeling something, they tell you about it honestly, right? Or if I screw up, that person tells me, but in a really kind way, right? Like just list out a couple things that make you trust this person. And then with a new person, make a little star. You could make kind of like an asterisk on a piece of paper. And on each end, each spoke, right, each point, write that quality, right? Like honesty or, keeps a secret, right? And then picture that new person, and then along that each line, mark how close that person is to that quality. So maybe going all the way towards the end is, yes, they definitely have this, it's demonstrated, there's tons of evidence that they keep my secrets, right? And you could put that dot all the way towards the point. But if you don't know, or it's pretty low, you could go towards the middle, right? And you might put a question mark somewhere, right? Like, okay, I haven't told this person a secret before. I haven't told them personal information. I don't know if they're going to keep it or keep my confidence. So maybe that's a opportunity to gather some data. Maybe I tell them something personal about myself and then see how that goes. Yeah. Right. So it's nice because it highlights like, okay, what are some actual like observable behaviors of trust? Does this person demonstrate it? And if they haven't, or you don't know, find out. So.
Yeah, that is cool. I've noticed a lot of people also tend to think that all their friends need to be the same level of close. Like they have to keep them in, and it can be some work to be like, okay, some people can be acquaintances or some people can be friends for certain instances, and that's all depends on how much you trust them. And you can trust people at different levels, and that's okay. They can stay in your life. I think a lot of problems happen when somebody's like, everybody in my life needs to be somebody I can trust. They need to be really intimate, and then people start disappointing you, and that core belief starts at being aggravated of like, I can't trust anyone. I can't trust anyone. So learning how to be a bit nimble with who you trust and how much of a part they have in your life. I thought of a couple other effects of abusive relationships, romantic relationships specifically, that, I mean, it's a bit anecdotal, but I can say one of my experiences after my first emotional abusive relationship, I noticed that I almost started identifying with him or wanting to adopt some of his qualities so that I could understand him better, so that it didn't have to be he's a bad person. It was almost like, okay, well then I'll be a bad person too, so then we can be together. And then this won't have been real. This doesn't have to be such a fracture. And also that helped deal with the resistance I have to being a victim. It was like, okay, well, if I can be shitty too, if I can understand him in these ways, empathize in these ways, and that's not the storyline. Yeah, another thing that someone was telling me recently was this is more related to sex. So their boyfriend would put them down constantly for not being exciting enough in bed. And sexual function was fine, orgasms were fine, but sex wasn't very enjoyable mentally. And then she was in a new relationship, and the relationship was better, the intimacy was better, but suddenly this fear returned of like, maybe I'm not being exciting enough. And then she couldn't have an orgasm. And it was very confusing. It's like, why am I suddenly feeling dysfunction in a new relationship that I wasn't feeling in my first relationship? And it's because of the, of the wearing down of her self-esteem.
Yeah.
That had happened in the first relationship. And so it's just a warning that sometimes things can crop up in new relationships that you don't necessarily expect. And it can be very confusing because it's like, I feel safer here. So why is this coming up?
That's a really good point. That's really confusing for people. When people experience traumatic experiences in the past, sometimes when that happens, this is getting into trauma, when that happens, some people feel a numbing, or they almost blank out, or they feel just blanket fear. They just don't... they just respond to it kind of like a fight or flight survival mode. And then when they're in the safer place, like with a therapist or with a new relationship that is safer, all those feelings start to come back. Right. So, that's not to say that person is the new person is the problem, but it might just be that you're at a place where you could take a breath and, feel your feelings.
Yeah.
Yikes.
But that can be a good sign.
Yeah.
Sign of healing, even if it feels like you're dysfunctional. Well, if you don't want to be emotionally abusive towards us, and you don't... Kip is already laughing because my tone signals what's coming up. And you don't want us to feel useless and worthless, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That'd be the right thing to do. And we'll see you all next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.